in trying to come to an agreement on the sort of goals and who this would be benefiting and who the audience is for this work before we would consider how to actually, what type of document it would come out as. So I have a list of a couple of possible goals that we could address with this kind of work. I'd be curious to hear from others about what they see is needed in terms of like what are the current issues that you are facing with the existing state of things as you are talking to people and working with people who are using the specs.
That's a good idea to maybe focus on the problem statement first, or like and what audience. Presumably that's part of the problem statement we are trying to reach out to. What is your take on that problem statement?
Yeah, so the challenges that I'm seeing when I'm talking to people, working with people who are building systems, I'm primarily working with people who are building applications as well as like client applications as well as resource servers. Obviously, as you know, Okta, I work at Okta, and Okta provides an authorization server, so we don't typically work with people who are building authorization servers. We're working with people who are building resource servers and client applications. So they're really looking for understanding how to architect the different parts of their system and how that maps to OAuth. So that's what I'm trying to communicate. And then as part of that, there's a lot of questions about, well, if they're at all familiar with reading some of the specs, they don't necessarily see how these different pieces fit together or what the latest recommendations are doing to like what the implications are for their work. So yeah, one of the things that I'm hoping to accomplish with this is to really reduce the amount of different things that they have to read, or reducing the amount of things that they read that are then sort of overridden by later things. So as someone's going through the spec, there's a lot of things in all the documents that later become obsolete by later documents, or just clarified better in later documents where some of the optional things become required, things like that. But yeah, the primary audiences for that I'm trying to address are these developers of resource servers and client applications.
Aaron?
Yes.
Dave here. Would these people, are they really going and looking? I'm just wondering how many of them are actually going out and looking at the specs versus reading, any of the great write-ups on what to do. You guys have some great write-ups on your site, as do other vendors in the space.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a fair question.
Yeah, because it seems like you would just point them. It's like, well, here's the write-up that condenses it all down, and would also help them with information that's specific to your offering that obviously would not be in the specifications.
Sure. So what I typically see is that people definitely start with that, more easily discoverable, higher level summary version of the documents, of whether that's the books or blog posts or whatever it is. But then as people start to get into the specifics of it, and when they start making decisions about like their own architecture in terms of the different token validation methods or things like that, that's where people start then diving in, like finding the specs and then pointing to paragraphs and being like, well, this says this, why does it work this way? Or why don't you do this? And that kind of thing. Because also, frankly, like, because there's so many different ways you can build an authorization server and still be technically OAuth 2, a lot of the things that are in the specs don't necessarily reflect the way that any given authorization server works. So there's that sort of that disconnect of people are referencing the specs because they are looking for the sort of source of truth, and then wondering, well, why doesn't that match what's in the real world?
Well, this problem won't really be solved by piling on another layer. To say that people will still, like the thing that you just said, which OAuth does not guarantee interop is absolutely true, will remain true even if you aggregate and you put together the latest and greatest. Like, unless you start producing profiles, this problem will not go away.
Yeah, just listen to that, Aaron. There's some choices, but potentially part of the challenge is there's choices that you guys have made at Okta that make sense for you. And what I'm hearing is that the customer goes and reads something in the spec and says, but I want to go and do X. And you guys say, well, we don't do X. And they're like, but that's how I want to do X. And so it's actually maybe a valid path, but for a variety of reasons, you guys aren't supporting that. So what are you saying is that a new document that's a standard would address those types of questions?
I guess it's, go ahead.
I was just going to jump in because that's not really what I'm hearing. Is that this would be like anything provider specific. And this was a big part of the side conversation, is that this would be trying to capture what the group has largely considered to be best practice, because we've already got documents like Torsten's security document, the new one, that are saying to do things in a certain way and to not do things that are technically allowed but cause problems, and to not do them for specific reasons. So this isn't just, I am not hearing this at all as Okta just wanting to have their practices standardized, but more along the lines of have one document that says, follow this and you're doing all of the best practices without having to read other things.
Yeah, thanks. That's much better said.
I wasn't trying to insinuate that Okta was trying to say that the standard should be something that's Okta specific. I was digging more into what the problem is of going from what the customer confusion is. And it seemed, and maybe I misheard what you're saying, Aaron. Part of it was they look at what you're offering and then they see things in the spec that are different than what you're offering and they're confused. And so the difference could be those are some choices around how to implement, which I think is part of what Victoria was getting at, is that there are choices around what to do. And since it's a framework, there's a number of different choices. And so one area of confusion is choices that Okta made about what to implement. And the other area of confusion, it can be choices that Okta has made because that's the best security practice, which would be common for everybody. So of those two problems, is one more prevalent, or is only one of those exist? Aaron?
Well, so I don't want to make this all about Okta either. Like, absolutely not. Like, this is, I'm definitely trying to come at this from, with everybody in mind and from the standards point of view. So,
sorry, I'm not trying to do that. I'm just, I find it useful to dig into, you have customers that have a problem. So let's really understand what the problem is to make sure that what we deliver solves that problem, right? And so it could be that it's better Okta documentation, or it could be that I understand the proposal. I'm just wanting to make sure that it actually solves what the problem is.
Yeah, well, and I think there's a couple of different problems here that are sort of all bubbling up at the same time. So there's a couple of different angles to it. And the other part of it is when someone, when someone picks up a library or looks at a different authorization server, evaluating 3 different open source authorization servers, and they're all labeled OAuth 2. It turns out that that's actually like almost meaningless at this point, because there's so many different ways it could work, when in reality, what this group is doing is actually, especially with the latest security BCP, is actually documenting a relatively restricted profile of what was published in 2012. So I think that's also the one of my other goals here, is that we, in reality, this group is saying, here is a more secure way to be doing this overall. And it would be nice if there was a label for that, so that when there is code published, either, anything from a product that's a company sells to an open source library to an open source product or whatever, we can capture that and say, like, yeah, this does actually follow the latest recommendations that this group has published.
So basically, you are saying that what the BCP says should be stated more strongly. Like, in the end, you're right that the BCP restricts the core, but I think that it still retains a lot of freedom. Let's say that even if people follow the BCP, they're still going to be able to do non-interoperable things.
Yeah, totally, and that's fine. There's just there's still a lot of things in there that are concrete and are more limited than the original.
It sounds like part of what you're saying is that telling people that we follow the BCP is kind of a weak label, a way of describing it, right? And that people say it's OAuth 2. And so part of, as I listen to it, if you call it OAuth 2.1, it's clear at a high level label that something being 2.1 follows the BCP.
Yeah, exactly. So, and one of the examples of this that I'm seeing already happening is people are updating servers or client libraries to support OAuth 2 with Pixie for single page apps like that. And that's a whole long label that they're now like documenting as pull requests or opening issues against to request people, support authorization code plus Pixie for this use case, which is something that's in the security BCP, right?
I would like to add my perspective on that, Thorsten speaking. First of all, on interoperability, the security BCP, as the name suggests, is about security, and we invested a tremendous time to come up with a conclusion how we think OAuth should be used in a secure fashion. It took us 5 years or so. What I have observed in the market is that people are not really aware of the BCP. If they search for specification, then they will end up with RFC 6749. And what I would like to ensure is that anyone that is searching for the OAuth specification will somehow come across this new rules, this new profile. So from my perspective, the best way would be to come up with an update for RFC 6749, or at least some annotation in the RFC that tells, here are new rules, you should follow those rules, because that's what the OAuth working group came up with. That's my primary interest, because what I have seen in the last couple of years when I was working with open banking initiatives, they do not know any other specification beside RFC 6749. That's a real and big problem from my perspective. And I said in the side meeting in Singapore, from my perspective, I'm really satisfied and happy once we do not need security BCP any longer. So I would like to see all the rules and the more precise guidelines how to use OAuth securely to be rolled up in a new RFC or an update for RFC 6749. That would make me really happy.
Thanks. Yeah, and I think that really gets to the point of, I think it really gets to the core of it, which is that right now when people look for OAuth, they do find 6749, and it's very hard to find the rest of it. You have to know how to navigate IETF space. You have to know what a working group is. A lot of people don't even realize there is one. They just think it's all IETF. And you have to really know how to find all of the documents that come after that in order to end up at the security BCP, for example. So I think that's, yeah, I think it's a great summary of the problem.
And we could also use that to make the specification simpler, because we just removed a lot of functionality.
Are there any counter arguments?
Change the spec. I think that there's many. Let's say that we know it's going to be very, very expensive to change the core. I think that Thorsten suggested something that might be a great compromise, which is to have references to the BCP directly from the core spec, so that the discoverability problem is solved. But if we were to try to actually update the spec, I think that it would take quite a long time, because the restrictions that we are doing for security reasons are valid, but at the same time, I think that there might be situations in which people have a mitigating circumstances which cannot be generalized, but they do apply to that specific case. And taking that choice away from them is going to be hard. And I think it's possible, but it will lead to a lot of discussion. So I think that we might end up doing a lot of work, and ultimately we might achieve basically the same just by having an explicit reference to the BCP from the RFC.
Strictly speaking,
Mike Peck from MITRE. I wanted to chime in. We've been spending a lot of time profiling the use of OAuth for large enterprise environments. So writing down what requirements we expect ASs and clients and resource servers to meet and right. Obviously, pointing at RFC 6749 isn't sufficient, and I think the working group's already done most or all of the hard work of writing down what's expected. It's just littered across a whole bunch of documents, and certainly if OAuth could be updated to a 2.1 that incorporates all of that, and we can go out there and say, hey, we expect these products that we're purchasing, developing, whatever, to meet the OAuth 2.1 requirements. I think that would make our lives a lot easier.
could you say again? Like I'm trying to write down some notes. What would make your life easier if we have? I think this was Michael.
Yeah, so having a single OAuth 2.1 RFC to point to that incorporates all the great work the working group's done. So in the new security BCP draft, but also other BCPs like the native apps work, mutual TLS, the JWT access token specification. Because right, we're trying to put out requirements for either product procurement, product development, whatever of what products are expected to me. Obviously, OAuth 2.0 as it is in the RFC 6749 isn't sufficient, and trying to point at all these other working group documents for what to do, it makes things very complicated. So right, if there were one, preferably IETF less document that conveyed all these, conveyed the most up-to-date consensus on what to do, on both for those procurement reasons, for someone to point to, and it's like if we could go to a vendor or we're developing something or whatever and say this is OAuth 2.1 compliant and have some sort of common definition of what that means, that would just be a huge help.
So you brought up a couple of other topics. One is the scope of what, or Dick, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think what he's saying is that he doesn't want to list, oh, it's OAuth 2 with the BCP and Pixie and JWT. Like there's a whole large list of things, which makes it hard for people to understand. And so I think that, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, Michael, is that you want a crisp answer of saying we would like something that's OAuth 2.1 compliant. And everybody knows what that means because there's a document about that.
Yeah, exactly. I think there'd still be a debate to have of how much text would be duplicated in said document versus that one document just pointing at other things. At the very least, it'd be nice if it removed all the things in OAuth 2.0 that we don't think are acceptable to do anymore. And then if it referred to other documents and said, here, you should do Pixie, it's described here, et cetera, that I think that would be fine versus just duplicating all the text.
Yeah. It's more around that crisp label of what it is. It goes to a document that maybe points to a bunch of other places and says what to take and not take out of other documents, but that your mechanism of communicating to others about your expectations is clear.
Right. Yeah, and we're trying to write that down for enterprise use. It's one thing for us to put it in a document and stick a MITRE label on it or some government label on it or whatever and share it. The message certainly comes across much nicer if it has a IETF a label on it, and I think I think pretty much the hard work has been done by the working group already. It's just a matter of putting it all together into one place. So
Vittorio, it sounded like you're thinking that if I read between the lines, it sounds like you're thinking that, well, those might be best practices most of the time, but some of the time, some of these other things are what's right in a particular situation. And so maybe you have some concerns that that 2.1 document might be too restrictive and then not allow people or cause confusion for people that are trying to do something and saying, well, you want me to do X, but it's not in 2.1. So why are you suggesting I do that?
So I want to point out, not to jump on Vittorio here, but I want to point out that anything we do with a 2.1 does not delete 2.0 as an option either from the marketplace or from the standards world. So to me, that is the obvious answer is you want to do something that is allowed in 2.0 and not in 2.1. Well, say you're doing 2.0 and not 2.1.
Yeah, but I think part of, and I'm reading between the lines of what Vittorio is saying is that it causes confusion, similar confusion on that the 2.1 solves by saying, well, here's what to do, but then there's confusion to other people where if Vittorio is saying, well, go ahead and do this, and then he's arguing with customers and saying, but that's not in 2.1. But I'm going to let Vittorio chime in here now.
Thanks. So I think that the main thing that I'm concerned about is the work. That's to say that to me the bar for changing the core, and I know that it's version, so one might say I'm sticking to 2.0, but in my experience, in reality, it usually doesn't work. Let's say that especially people that don't really know about the space, they'll just go for the latest because like that's the safe way of thinking about it. So we'll have a discussion anyway. But to me, the main challenge is I suspect that we'd get a similar effect if we'd just have to say help people to navigate the various options. And I think that a lot of the work that has been done for security and for enterprise are for fleshing out specific cases that are very important. But bringing this back to the core would be shoving down the throat of everyone the characteristics of those cases. Personally, I'm partial to the enterprise cases, so it would work well for me. But I don't know if it would be serving well the community by, I'd say, generalizing those particular cases to everyone. And the other challenge that I have is that it's mostly that these will take a lot of work for basically somehow redoing things that we have already done rather than working on new stuff. Like, in the end, everyone has somewhat limited bandwidth. And so given that we already, like if we have a goal of helping people to adopt the specific things that we did for BCP and others, it looks like this idea of a hitchhiker guide to the specs might achieve that without all the work that instead we would have that would go into creating a new version of the core. It's mostly the amount of work that concerns me.
I want to touch on something you said there, which was like I absolutely agree that I don't want to force the sort of like enterprise stuff down the throats of everybody else, because I also have I also use the OAuth framework for things that are completely not enterprisey and very small implementations that I use myself, for example. So yeah, I have no interest in like forcing everybody to use JSON Web Token for access tokens, for example, because that's not relevant to a situation when there's a small authorization server plus resource server built into the same system. So those specifics, I think we can leave the specifics of that up to like when we actually would start this work, because that's just a matter of documenting what goes where. But I think overall, yeah, I agree with the goal that I don't want to make things more burdensome for people who don't need to implement something because it's not relevant to their implementation. That makes sense.
I think it's going to be those types of specifics, though, that become difficult to reach agreement on when we actually get into the work. If we were trying to do something like a 2.1 where you could say what's been expressed by someone, where you could stamp it as 2.1 compliant and some sort of perceived guaranteed interoperability about that. I think those specifics will actually turn out to be very, very difficult to come to agreement on. And I guess I would echo what Vittorio said about, you know, what's maybe most useful, at least bang for the buck, would be some sort of guide to the existing standards and, you know, helping people find them, helping them know if they're relevant to their needs or not, rather than trying to roll it all up into a single, you know, super 2.1 profile, but just laying out things like, oh, Pixie exists and here's how it's useful and here's a pointer to it. Some sort of like entry point or starting point to the existing set of specifications that would help somebody navigate them and understand what they need to do and why. It may not achieve all the ends that people are looking for here, but I think it might be the most obtainable output work and one that has the most value relative to the amount of work that would be required to go into it. Something to think about.
I think you're talking about two different types of documents, because that to me sounds more like an umbrella document that explains the OAuth universe.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think there's a lot of people that have different ideas here about what the output of this work would be, and I guess I'm just suggesting that some kind of umbrella document like that might be more achievable and more value relative to the amount of work that takes to do it than actually trying to nail down a 2.1. I know that doesn't meet your need of or your desire of sort of obsoleting the BCP, but I have a sneaking suspicion that trying to actually get to that point may prove to be more difficult or even impossible than it seems like at the outset of conversations like this.
I don't think it's going to be easy.
Okay, that's fair.
Nothing we do is going to be easy, and once we open that box for a new version of the BCP, new RFC, a lot of desire will pop up. But I would intentionally keep. First of all, I would differentiate different types of documents. So my first goal is to really clean up the confusion that might be caused by the fact that the RFC and the BCP state different things. And I would be really object against writing a 2.1 that incorporates a lot of extension modules, for example, JWT and so on. Why would I object? From my perspective, the way the OAuth space is designed with the core and the different extension modules, for me, works perfectly. OAuth is very flexible when it comes to implementation, because we focused on only getting the stuff in the RFC that is required for interoperability from a client to AS perspective. Perfect. Under the hood, you can have tremendously different implementations, and would really object against limiting that flexibility. So I'm not looking for a 2.1 that really incorporates all those different bits and pieces, because they all are required in different circumstances. And regarding interoperability, RFC 6749 is not really interoperable on a bit level. With the things that we have specified in the security BCP, we are getting a bit closer to interoperability, because we, for example, have a more precise rules around redirect URI matching, which was impossible to implement in an interoperable fashion previously. So a bit of interoperability is possible from my perspective, but I would like to keep the scope of a potential 2.1 narrow. I wouldn't really go far beyond the scope of the current RFC. That's my point on it.
Thanks, I agree with that. And I think that also addresses some of the concerns hearing from others as well, because yeah, the flexibility is good. in that it lets people build, repurpose it for different things in interesting ways and build onto it. But there's too much flexibility in the core, and I think the security BCP gets it right, where there's flexibility in the right places, but still locks down enough of the sort of basic stuff to make it secure.
So quick question to Torsten, just a follow up on say, would a guide, hitchhiker guide kind of a solution address your need, or do you think a 2.1 is really needed?
I think I stated the problem I have with any kind of guide. I mean, the security BCP itself is a guide. And people just don't find it. They don't know it exists. That's my basic and fundamental problem. And the second thing is, even if they know it exists, they potentially don't understand what the relationship is between RFC 6749 and the security BCP. And they potentially don't understand the felt conflicts between those documents. So that's why I want to clean it up. And by the way, you're really not really loud. So can you speak up a bit?
Oh, sorry. Is it better?
Yeah, much better. Thank you.
Okay. So, but wouldn't the guide's role versus 2.1, wouldn't that guide explain the missing part that you're missing, and then point to the right places? Or do you think that the label 2.1 is really critical?
I don't know whether the label 2.1 is critical. I think I stated that in the beginning. What I would like to achieve is that if someone looks up OAuth and lands at RFC 6749, there should be a something telling this person, hey, here's something you need to take into consideration. Could be another RFC, could be a link to the security BCP. I'm really open, right? Deep within my heart, I feel I would like to clean up the mess, right? And that's why I think a new RFC at 2.1 would be the best way to go. Because if I only have one document, I do not need to explain the difference between two documents.
I would like to point out one of the other concerns I have about any sort of guide is that it looks optional and it looks informal. And I'm even seeing this with the security BCP right now, which is that people look at it and then they say, oh, well, it's just a BCP, so I don't have to do it. And then they like ignore significant parts of it. When in reality, the message we're trying to send with that is, this is the way it should be done now. And you should be starting here, right? So people just sort of ignore it because they think it's optional because it's, just a BCP.
But doesn't this contrast with what we said earlier, in which we said that there are situations in which things that we would put in these ideal things do not apply to everyone?
Well, I would hope that we wouldn't put those kinds of things into the core, right?
Isn't the BCP in itself something in which we say, okay, this one would be the ideal situation, but like if there is someone that have unless we really want to override the core, as in we are saying, okay, now we would like everyone to do what the BCP does. In all cases, in all scenarios, regardless of their particular scenario, then it seems that that would be forcing that on them.
I think that's the difference between a should and a must in the BCP, though.
I'm sorry, say again?
I think that's the difference between a should and a must in the BCP. Something in the BCP that says must really does mean you have to do it this way. And something that could be optional is should. And there's both of those in the document right now.
Right. So I think the difference is that if like putting a must in the BCP or putting a must in the core, the kind of discussion that occurs, I would expect it to be different. Let's say that, that the BCP has this kind of flexibility, whereas if instead you bring it back to the core, then it's a true must. Then at that point, I think that a number of the things that we have in the BCP might end up being rediscussed.
So am I misunderstanding the purpose of a BCP then? Because I thought this was meant to be, this is what OAuth 2.0 should be now. And this is a mechanism to accomplish that. In this document format is how we accomplish that. And we really are saying, if there's a must in here, it's equivalent to a must in the core, assuming you're following both documents.
That's also my perception, and I'm remembering the discussions we had around some of the statements in the BCP, and we had longer and harder discussions than I can remember when we did RFC 6749. So from the working group's behavior, I would deduce everybody was assuming, hey, we are updating the RFC.
I remember side conversations in which some of the conclusions were, hey, it's just the BCP. So I assumed that some of this mindset was also transferred in there. That doesn't mean that we were, I would say, light-hearted when we discussed those things. But I think that given that there is a mechanism for actually updating the RFCs, and given that we didn't use that mechanism, but we did the BCP, my understanding was the BCP is a different type of document than the core in itself. Then I'm sure that everyone has a different perception on this. And also, I remember that there were discussions about like the deprecation of ROPG, and things like people were saying, yeah, it's okay to do it in the BCP because we are not really doing this in the core. So I think there might be some clarification to be made here, not just among ourselves, but also for the community, as in what the BCP means.
I mean, in the end, I would not assume that everyone that is in the security BCP would automatically go into an RFC. We would go through the whole working group process again, so we could have all the discussions that are needed. Just having said that, in the beginning, the security BCP didn't have the objective that it ended up having now. There is a reason why this document still is titled Security Topics and not Security BCP. Because when we started in 2015, it was exactly that, a laundry list of things that we need to cope with. And we already at that time had a discussion whether we should update the RFC or do a BCP. And then over time, this thing evolved into a BCP. So there's a lot of history that one needs to take into consideration to understand why we came up with a BCP and not an update of the RFC. It was just a decision in the process. And it doesn't mean that we can't reconsider what we have decided 2 or 3 years ago.
And we can absolutely reconsider. Again, the main thing that I'm concerned about is the amount of work that it will require. And like I keep hearing people saying that the big problem is discoverability. And I really think that by embedding references in the core and language that says you've got to read that these other things might actually solve the discoverability problem. And there might still, like, of course, there will be more confusion than if we'd actually hone down a document and selectively bring things in and have a new version of the core. I just don't know if the extra that you'd obtain by doing that is justified versus instead just having pointers from the RFC to the other docs.
But I think this goes back to what I was saying earlier, which is that there's more than one problem, and the discoverability is one problem. But I think there's other problems as well that are not solved by just these pointers.
Well, it sounds like one of the problems that I've heard a couple of people say is having a crisp reference of saying, you know, here's what we want to have built for us, or, you know, here's what I want to buy. And someone else may say, well, here's what I deliver, and in a way that clearly communicates what's happening as opposed to what's there now. Aaron, I was wondering whether sort of a wrapper document that maybe if it's called, say it's called 2.1, but doesn't, you know, replicate much, if any, text, but really, you know, in the 6749, it would be pointed to, and this new RFC would say, here is 2.1, which is these parts of 6749, these best practices, this and this and this. And so it's more of a collection of where all to go as a starting point that's called 2.1 that everybody can reference to, but that we're not we're not making any new decisions. We're just capturing the decisions we've already made with a crisp label.
Yeah, that's definitely something that is an option. And like I said at the beginning, I'm not necessarily going into this with a goal of any particular end format. But I do want to settle on like what are the problems that we would be addressing with whatever format that would take. And I think you've just described a totally valid option as, you know, a format, something that the important thing is that I think the two key problems that we're consolidating on are discoverability and the definition of functionality, right? So having a label that describes a set of functionality.
So Aaron, I'm wondering, what is your impression? Do people find it easy to kind of combine all these mechanisms when they implement stuff? Because I think, so currently you have to read 6749, and then you have to keep in mind that you have to add those PXE parameters and the checks in the right places. And then you might want to add MTLS. So you have to take care of that. So it might be useful if we had one document that kind of explains all the things in one place, or let's say all the important things at least.
Yeah, definitely, because it's, you know, this is the discoverability problem of it's not even clear what you have to read in order to know the whole thing that you're going to be building when you just start at the beginning.
Yeah, I'm not so much talking about discoverability here, but more like, let's call it composability. So there might be challenges when you have to compose all these mechanisms. Because, so first of all, you have to remind what to do at each point in the protocol. And then there might be some behaviors that you have to take care of that only come into play when you have a certain extension in your implementation.
Yeah, this is a really good point. I think that, for example, MTLS, super useful, necessary for certain scenarios, probably not part of the core. So if you have a nice discoverable guide aggregator, like I like the thing that Dick said, but like adding on top of it, like this aspect of those are the other specs that are relevant for this particular scenario, and those are the parts that you'd want to do. That's something useful, but not necessarily something that is actually core. So I don't know how it would be positioned or labeled.
My question is, how many different things would we have to label? It sounds like they're different for different use cases. There are different sort of features that you want to use. Like, how many of those are we talking about? Like, it sounds that there's more than one label.
So it sounds, so one of the things that it seems like there's a bunch of concerns around what the document might be. You know, we're coming up on time. What might be useful would be to have sort of a rough draft of what the document could be, so we have a clear topic of what we like and don't like, what we think works and doesn't work about something. There's an awful lot of theory about what is the document at this point in time.
I would go one step further. I mean, we are at least talking about two different documents. And I strongly agree with Vittorio. I wouldn't really conflate an updated core or whatever with this kind of umbrella document that gives you an overview on all the bits and pieces that you could use for the various use cases.
Why wouldn't you want to reference though as in sort of a, I mean, I'm envisioning an umbrella document that references things and says, here's what you do, and if you have some other situations, here's other things to look at, right? So somebody has a place to start.
I think I see what Torsten's saying though, is that these are two different, they are two different things. An updated core is taking just the pieces of the existing core.
So this umbrella document is kind of a meta BCP, right? You're not only describing best practice for a certain use case, but you would also have some conditions. If you want to do that, you want to do that. That's more like writing a blog post or writing a book about OAuth or giving an architectural overview. That's fine. Having that, it's really fine. It could be useful, but that's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking to clean up the core spec and to realign it with the changes that we agreed on in the security PCP to make people's life easier with the core. So both can go side by side, but I would not like to conflate those.
Okay, well, that sort of highlights my comment, which is having some rough draft of something makes it crisp to all of us what it is and what it isn't. And there may be two documents.
I agree.
Well, Dick, you are the sort of the author of the original OAuth document, and maybe it would be on you to maybe make a proposal if you have time on how such a rough draft looks like based on the discussion. So, because we in any case have to confirm decisions on the mailing list, as you all know, and so it would be a little bit more visible on where this could be heading, right?
I can take a stab at a draft. Maybe I can work with Torsten on that too. I don't know if Dick wants to volunteer himself for that, but I'm happy to. And I think the first draft would be starting from 6749 and essentially applying the diffs in the security BCP to it. That's what I would do as a first draft, if that sounds reasonable to you, Torsten, at least.
Well, it's in general, it's practice to have particularly since Dick is still around, to have actually him as the original author to make a proposal.
Is that
Sure.
the case?
I didn't want to.
I hear him. That's actually true. I've seen plenty of instances where sort of the update in the BIS document and whatever are done by different authors for lots of different reasons. I'm not saying Dick shouldn't do it, but I'm saying that painting this as the traditional way to approach it is misleading.
Dick, do you want to do it?
I'd be happy and thrilled to work with Torsten and Aaron Arn pulling together a draft. And then we could post that to the mail list and have a conversation on the list that people could talk about what they think works and doesn't work. Assuming Aaron and Torsten are okay working with me.
Absolutely. I just didn't want to you to feel like you were getting forced into this.
Yeah, let's do it.
And we have a slot on this in Vancouver, so.
And of course, Rifat and I are always happy if you guys do some work. So that's excellent. And we'll obviously have to hash out the details and get an agreement. One question that we at some point in time then need to make on is whether this would be sort of like in a classical form of update. This would be just a new RFC that says this is the new version of OAuth 2.0, or whether that would be a BIS version, or whether that would be indeed a bump in the version number, which, funny enough, we actually don't have version numbers. So,
can you please? I mean, we've got 4 more minutes left. So, can you please explain in a few sentences what the difference is between those options?
The difference is in doing a BIS version is you are removing functionality, but you essentially keep the backwards compatibility in some sense.
Okay, so we can decide which way to go after we have decided what should be in the new version.
Exactly.
Good, got it. Thank you.
Well, that was a useful discussion. I took some notes, unfortunately on paper, because I don't like the typing while everyone is talking, and so we'll transcribe them. I enabled a recording if you've, and hopefully that worked, and so we can share that with the rest of the group, because I see a couple of the folks who are missing. So I envision, of course, as always, a lively mailing list discussion on any of those topics. So But I would like to thank you guys again for joining and for sharing your thoughts on this, I believe, interesting topic. Do you have anything else? Some famous last words, Rifat?
No, that's good. I think it's a good discussion for sure. Just the beginning here, so we'll see.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, guys. Thanks a lot.
Goodbye.
Thank
Bye,
you.
guys.
Thanks.